are looking at a view across the floor of the section Rule Instruction Algorithm, in which we really focused on building connections between programmed art and conceptual art, and ideas as the machine that makes the art, as WED would call it. On the other side of the floor, you are entering through the wall of video monitors, which is Namjoon Paik's Fin de Siècle, the second section of the show, which is signal sequence resolution. And this work is also instruction and rule-based, but focuses more on the resequencing of images and signals. So back to the first section of the show, in which you would encounter works such as a wall drawing by WED, the fourth wall from wall drawing 289 to be precise. So as you probably know, WED's work is really based on written instructions and then gets implemented in a museum. It doesn't exist as this wall, but has to be drawn each time. And we're juxtaposing that with Casey Rhea's software structures. Casey was one of the artists who pointed out in his work the strong connections between conceptual art and software art, which is always by nature based on instructions. And if you haven't seen the show, we're not projecting a still image of Casey's work, but you would see this work in action and the software running, building that connection. On that floor, you might also encounter works such as Mika Tajima's coded representation of data centers. So she starts by taking photographs and making sound recordings of data centers. You are not allowed to publish these photographs. So she transforms something like New York University Central Data Center into a Jacquard punch card, and the sound recordings taken on site into a digital spectrogram image, which you see here as this yellow, orange, red form that she colors. And then she also creates that spectrogram image, or these spectrogram images, since she takes photos and recordings at various sites, into a Jacquard weaving. Before Mika's work was hanging on that wall, you would have encountered Raphael Rosendaal's abstract browsing. We actually have to rotate some of these works. And you might easily recognize this as the Google interface. And it is, in fact, a translation of screenshots that Raphael takes through his abstract browsing series. So each and every one of you can download a Chrome extension and install it in your browser, and that will replace everything that is seen on the web page into these colorful rectangles and shapes. And Raphael here is very much interested in how the machine designs and sees. And just to show you what this page originally looked like, this is what it was. So both Raphael and Mika, in doing these Jacquard weavings, actually point to a very important moment in the history of computing, which is the Jacquard weaving loom, which was created by Jacquard in 1804, and you see an image of an original one on the top right here. So weaving as a generative form in order to create patterns actually started with the punch cards that would also be used in early computing. So the history of computing and weaving is deeply intertwined, and just to juxtapose what a more recent version of that massive punch card looks like, you also see this image from Norway. Generative art is actually very important to the history of digital art. Generative art meaning art that starts with an instruction, that sets a process into motion, that ultimately executes a work of art. And we have a whole section in the exhibition that explores that generative art. Another example seen here would be Ian Cheng's Baby Feet Icaria, which is a simulation of 3 chatbots, artificial intelligences, commercial ones actually, talking to each other. And the conversation between them animates the debris that you see floating on the screen. And it really oscillates between a very organic form and the kind of machinic that is typical of conversations with Siri or other bots. Other generative art included in the exhibition includes Cheney Thompson's Broken Volume 10 Leaders. So this sculpture is part of a series that all consists of sculptures that are 10 liters in volume, created by these 1-inch concrete cubes. So Cheney, in creating this work, uses an algorithm called the Drunken Walk algorithm, which is used to map unpredictability. So the algorithm just does its job and generates a form, but it does not pay any attention to the weight distribution of the sculpture. Hence, it very easily breaks, as the systems economically, etc., for which we use these algorithms. So what you have here on the pedestal is actually a sculpture that broke in half when we brought it to the museum. So this is what it looked before it arrived at the show. And of course, that's scary for curators and conservators, but this is part of the process. This is why the sculpture is named Broken Volume, and Cheney assured us that it will probably break again when we take it out of the exhibition. So on the other side, you will enter signal sequence resolution and the ideas of resequenced images through Namjoon Paik's massive sculpture Fin de Siècle, which also uses instructions and rules in order to remix video and create choreography of dancing patterns, videos including Kraftwerk, David Bowie, Merce Cunningham, and performance by Joseph Beuys. And in that section of the exhibition, you might encounter works such as Lynn Hirschman Leeson's Lorna, which was the first interactive art video done on Laserdisc. And in this installation, you're using a remote control to navigate the branching story of Lorna, who is an agoraphobic trapped in her apartment. The installation itself actually mirrors the environment in which Lorna lives on the screen, and it's a very feminist narrative that plays with ideas of remote-controlled women, just to give you one example. Also, in that section of the exhibition, you will encounter a grouping called Encoded Realities, which is more politically and socially oriented, and Jonah Brooker-Cohen and Catherine Moriwaki's work is also part of that. So in that section, you will see work such as Keith and Mandy Obadika's The Interaction of Colors, created in the early 2000s. And what Keith and Mandy did here is create satirically a fake company that sells you a color check system for your skin color, very much pointing to the fact that the web from its start never was a neutral space that didn't pay attention to race or ethnicity, but always had that data deeply inscribed into e-commerce. So all of the works in Programmed resonate with the world that is becoming increasingly encoded. So you might encounter augmented reality in ads right now. You're getting used to being constantly surveyed on the street for security purposes. Images are getting projected onto your contact lenses. Our mail is being delivered by drones. We're sitting in self-driving cars. And the elderly are kept active and engaged through devices such as LEQ, which might be a very dystopian world, but one we definitely also need to pay attention to. So in the following, we want to broaden the conversation by exploring the evolution of virtual and algorithmic practices and the role that art can play in our increasingly coded world. Our first presenter will be Erki Hutamo. Erki is a professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, in the Department of Design, Media Arts, and Film, Television, and Digital Media. He is an internationally renowned media historian and theorist, and a specialist in the history of aesthetics of media art, and also one of the founders of an emerging approach to media studies known as media archaeology, which I know many of the students here will be familiar with. Among Erki's books are Media Archaeology, Approaches, Applications and Implications, and Illusions in Motion, Media Archaeology of the Moving Panorama and Related Spectacles, published by the MIT Press in 2013. Erki has curated numerous exhibitions in Europe, the United States, and Australia, among them the major international exhibition Alien Intelligence for Kiasma, the Kiasma Museum of Contemporary Art in Helsinki, Finland, which took place in 2000, and also retrospectives of the work of Toshio Iwai, Perry Hoberman, Paul Marinis, and Bernie Lubell. In 2000, Finland's Museum of Cultures presented Phantasmagoria, Time Traveling in the Moving Image, an exhibition which featured Erki's extensive collection of antique magic lanterns, peep show boxes, animation devices, and other media archaeological artifacts. I've seen part of that collection and it is truly impressive. So parts of it have since been shown at UCLA's libraries and also the UCLA Hammer Museum of Art. So please welcome Erki Hutamo.
All right, so thank you, Christiane. It was a great pleasure to fly from freezing and rainy Southern California to freezing and snowy New York. And it's a great pleasure also to be in this panel. So I have had shall we say, a very fruitful collaborative relationship with on these fields with Christiane for a long time, so sharing a lot of information. I've been very impressed by the work over the years that Christiane has done, really not only to work with the latest forms of digital art, but also to preserve the memory of media art. And I think that this is one of the topics we will be talking today. So these are very brief presentations, and I have a notorious reputation of going over time. I'm trying to sort of like prove that I can be very quick and brief. So I'm calling my short presentation Ars Longa Memoria Brevis. Art is long, but the memory is short. What I mean is that even though we do have these amazing efforts by Christiane and others to actually to write and maintain this sort of like understanding of these historical links and connections behind the sort of like contemporary moment in this field of linking art and technology and media. There's also plenty of evidence that memory is not distributed evenly, and it's not distributed on all possible levels within contemporary society. So there are many problematic issues that I encounter very often. I would like to begin by showing two highly interesting events that you probably encountered yourself through the media that happened in October 2018. First of all, this painting, which you see right here, was sold for $432,500 at Christie's. What made it special is that Christie's promoted that this is the first painting made by an artificial intelligence ever put into an auction. This was done, basically signed by a so-called French art collective named Obvious. Before 2018, nobody had ever heard anything about these people behind that label. So the issue became highly interesting already before finally the auction was closed, and it was found out that this painting was sold for more money than a couple of Warhols and other name artists working the same auction, because there were comments that was raised on the internet basically saying that this whole thing is absolutely nothing, and it's pretty much like a kind of a sham, this whole idea. First of all, it was pointed out that it was based on using an algorithm written 15 by another person, actually in this case 19-year-old college student. These artists proved to be 25 years old students from France who wanted to make a little bit of extra money, and for that reason they had started a very hefty promotional campaign on the internet, so in the beginning of the year, with continuous kind of like press releases about this sensation which was on the way. And so in the summer, Christie's contacted these people asking for this piece to be, if that would be available for their fall auction. So there are very many curious and problematic issues, I think, in this case. And for me, one of the problematic and interesting things here is not the debate about the potential quality or lack of quality behind this work, but the fact that in this whole publicity surrounding this case, there were no mentions to numerous earlier artists using generative processes who had done highly regarded work. One of these people obviously would be Harold Cohen, who for over 30 years created complex painting artificial intelligence. Harold Cohen did not do it as a sort of like college student or a university student. He did it as an already established visual artist who had represented the UK at the Venice Biennale at the British Pavilion in the 1960s. After that, he got interested in exploring possibilities of creating artificial intelligence that would paint in ways like he might have painted himself, as a kind of a mirror, but not a truthful mirror, and a mirror with a certain amount of sort of like independence. So nowhere was Harold Cohen's name or the names of several other people already done work mentioned. The other case actually happened not at the Christie's but at the Sotheby's, and this was a case that you surely have heard about, which was the auction of a piece by Banksy, the former street artist, which was part of a series of graphical works, The Girl with the Balloon. And so when the auction was finished, right away the print started actually magically rolling down, revealing that a shredder had been built into the frame. So the work actually started going down into these strips of paper. Funny videos were posted online about that action, but perhaps the funniest thing was that the process did not go through all the way. So it started hanging like you see right there, and of course that became a huge inspiration in the internet meme space for all kinds of variations. And of course your university students take the best out of that, especially if they are frustrated with their grades. But anyway, what we see happening here was equally problematic, I think, in the sense that once again there were hardly any references to histories behind these ideas. The other problematic issue is the debate whether Banksy actually had programmed this hidden mechanism to go only through halfway, which actually would raise significantly the value of this the artwork, making it a kind of a unique. You can imagine that if it had been going through all the way to the floor in those countless stripes, the reaction and the discussion might have been different. So Banksy tried to say that in tests it had functioned perfectly and the whole thing had been destroyed, but I wouldn't take Banksy's words for face value. So we do have something that is highly interesting and important, and which was completely hidden behind everything. So we think about Gustav Metzger and the destruction in art movement in the 1960s, his famous acid painting actions where the artwork is destroyed while it is being created. Or, of course, Jean Tinguely's famous homage to New York, which was a self-destructing device that destroyed itself in the courtyard of the MoMA here in New York in 1960. So we have a long tradition, and this tradition has been partly documented in books like Gamboni's The Destruction of Art, or the catalog from the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, Damage Control. So we think about here very important issues, and I think that the one question that these things raise is, okay, the history has been sort of like in a way pushed down or sort of like pushed between the lines, but does it matter? Who cares? Is that history important? Is it important to know that there were this many works done before that, before these highly publicized actions took place? Now we can also say that ars longa but memoria occulta revelandum est. So there is a hidden memory that is worth revealing, and I'm coming up to the end of my time, so I can just show you a couple of two cases how I look at these things from media archaeological point of view. First of all, we have media art works that seem to be pointing rather explicitly to the kind of layered histories that lie behind these things. And the interesting thing is that these histories are not limited to the world of art. So art is not a field of island for these artists. Art is an element of a much more complex structure, both in history and space. And I think that the wonderful example would be, for example, the work of the New York-based artist Ken Feingold. For example, his piece Sinking Feeling, which is another piece linked with AI, so artificial intelligence. But basically, it is a head that has conversations with you. It is programmed in a very specific way to sort of like project a kind of a crazy personality, which of course caused problems for Ken when a collector was interested in buying one of these pieces, and then found out that it did not function exactly like Apple's Siri. So if Siri is there and that is the standard for buying an artwork, I think it's a moment we might lose hope. So anyway, but what we easily see when looking at this kind of work, we see that it is a work that actually engages in active conversation between these complex histories that go behind these things, from Joseph Weizenbaum, Elisa, conversational kind of play with the idea about the artificial intelligence from the 60s, or even much earlier things like Abe Mikkel's Talking Heads was exhibited in the late 18th century, which were automata figures able to talk. And so if you look at this comparison, so this probably makes it clear, even though Ken's piece is interactive, so you can actually talk to the head and get sometimes very baffling replies from the artwork. There's also, of course, the tradition of ventriloquism, which we find behind that work, but also behind by Ken Feingold's self-portrait as the center of the universe, ironically positioning a simulacrum of the artist within this strange company. My final other example would have to do with the locus communis, or the commonplace, and in a kind of an ironic but also complex, perhaps kind of an homage to that. These are works by Lynn Hirschman, whose Lorna is shown at the exhibition at the Whitney. A series of photographs called Phantom Limbs. And the interesting thing I think here is that this is an artwork that probably is asking for interpretation, asking for a context. And that context is anything but clear. At least the context, if we think about certain kind of an intentionality behind it. For we do have the same motive from many different fields, and these fields often have nothing to do with art. They have to do with internet imaging, stock imagery, some kind of strange stunts, website for making TV heads for cosplay events and so on, or even strange figures making appearances, like in this particular Slowbot figure that's been appearing in a certain community, I think in South Carolina for many years. Or we can, of course, go to leak over to the advertising world, like you see right here. Or we can go to lithographic trade cards way back. Or we can get to something like this, which I've been analyzing in my research. This is a cartoon from Punch, 1862, which I've been linking with the cyborg discourse, because it shows a certain kind of a caricature of the figure of the photographer, a new figure, the culture of the time. So the roaming photographer is shown as a kind of a new kind of hybrid creature, obviously referring to Darwin's the famous book that had been published a little earlier. But basically what we see here is a motive that is traveling in culture. It is a motive that combines new technology with the figure of the organic body of the human. So the question we have to ask is that when we look at pieces like Lynn Hirschman's Phantom Limbs, in what sense and in what levels is that piece potentially related to this much longer history? These are the idea about topos that my work is much dealing with, so my media archaeological work. There are countless variations of these topos traditions, including this one here, which shows what can happen to that photographer. And then if you look at the early VR, the early 90s, so you see what can happen for a stupid person wearing a head-mounted display. Or what the French media artist Pierrick Sorand did in his piece Sans Titre, where basically you have a system that shows you a simulated kick in your buttocks. So you actually see that when you peep inside, you see that somebody is seemingly sneaking behind you and just about to kick you, but it's a ghost, there's nobody. So some of these things I hope can give a kind of elements for a context that I think that this kind of work between trying to combine art, media and technology is asking for. But what is it worth? I think that maybe we can find out in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Erki. So next up is Tamiko Thiel. You can make your way over. Tamiko was awarded the 2018 Immersive Media Visionary Pioneer Prize by the Society for Art and Technology in Montreal for 30 plus years of creating poetic objects and spaces of memory that explores social and cultural issues. She was lead product designer for the Connection Machine CM1, CM2 artificial intelligence supercomputer, which in 1989 was the fastest on Earth, and now is in the design collection of MoMA. From 1994 to 97, she was producer and creative director of the interactive virtual play space Starbright World in collaboration with Steven Spielberg. Her interactive VR projections include works such as Beyond Manzanar and The Travels of Mariko Uro, as well as Virtual Wall, Virtuelle Mauer, all of which she will briefly talk about. In 2017, she was Google VR Tilt Brush Artist in Residence, creating her award-winning VR artwork, Land of Cloud. Tamiko is a founding member of the augmented reality AR group Manifest AR, which organized an augmented reality intervention at MoMA here in New York in 2010, and she's the curator and organizer of the Manifest AR intervention at the 2011 Venice Biennial. These projects actually led to multiple commissions, including Gardens of the Anthropocene in 2016 from the Seattle Art Museum, and also her work currently on view on the Whitney's terraces.
Thank you, Christiana, for the invitation to the exhibit and also to this panel. So she asked me to do an overview. This is going to be like a lightning talk. We'll see if it's comprehensible. So I started out, as she mentioned, as a product designer. I was lead designer on Danny Hillis's connection machine CM1, CM2, the first commercial massively parallel supercomputer designed for artificial intelligence. In 1989, 30 years ago, she mentioned it was the fastest supercomputer in the world. Today it's the equivalent of an iPhone 5 that probably none of you want to have in your pocket anymore. Its legacy lives on surprisingly because this is not well known. In Google, for instance, Sergey Brin, the co-founder, learned his massively parallel programming chops on a connection machine, and then took another of Danny Hillis's companies, MetaWeb, bought it up for Google, and that became the basis of their prowess in artificial intelligence, actually. And my good friend Joanna Hoffman reported to me, Joanna was on the first team of that created the Macintosh, and she followed Steve Jobs to Next company when he started that. And she reported to me years afterwards that he had asked her, find out who was the product designer of the connection machine. I want them to do the next cube. And Joanna said, unfortunately, Tamiko's gone to Europe to go to art school, and I don't have her contact information. So this little anecdote, which was confirmed by Joanna, was probably one of the major reasons why MoMA brought it into its collection a couple of years ago. And it's the large machine in the middle, the small one to the side is one cube knockoff. So after doing art school in Munich, I ended up in the mid-90s in San Francisco, at a time when not only the web was coming up, but also the technology to do interactive 3D computer graphics for the first time on PCs instead of on the $100,000 workstations you would have needed a year before. And so I was creative director and producer in collaboration with Steven Spielberg of Starbright World, the first online 3D multi-user play space for children. It was for hospital children. We had 5 children's hospitals hooked up nationwide, and the monitors would be in the playroom. They would come out of their hospital beds, play together, and go off and look for E.D., who was, of course, Steven Spielberg's avatar. And the doctors told us from the beginning, in those days, the problem of VR nausea was much worse, and the kids already were nauseous from their medications. They were already connected to machines, so they said, no, we'll just keep it on monitor. And I took this to heart when I started making my own artworks with this technology and said, no, I will stay away from VR headsets. After all, I want to have groups be able to view this simultaneously, families. So Beyond Manzanar was a simulation of parts of the Manzanar internment camp where Japanese Americans were interned in World War II, and we put on a parallel layer with Azara Hushmand of the similar attempts to intern Iranian Americans in the hostage crisis. And in this piece, you're walking through the internment camp with apparent freedom to go anywhere and do whatever you want to, but of course there's a very strict rule-based structure behind it that says when you enter a barracks, the door shuts, you're trapped inside, you have to find another way out. There are paradise gardens that you can wander into, but if you go in too far, then they dissolve and they drop you back in the prison camp. All of this driven by a very simple joystick that can be used by anyone, including veterans who might use similar joysticks to steer their wheelchairs. Travels of Mariko Horo has a very different sort of content. I'm colliding the cosmologies of Christian art and of Buddhist cosmology together to create a world that's strange to both cultures. And again, you're propelling yourself through these various worlds, several heavens, several hells. But for instance, in the Last Judgment scene on your right, if you go to the right hand of the eight-armed Christ, then you will rise to heaven. If you go to the left hand of God, you will fall into burning hell, as tends to happen in a lot of religions. So the last large piece that I did with this technology, Virtual Mauer, was on the Berlin Wall, a similar structure where you have the apparent freedom to wander around West Berlin in the 80s, look at all the graffiti, much of which we have authentic replications of. If you tried to do the same in East Germany and get too close to certain parts of the wall, then the Volkspolizei pop up, arrest you, and interrogate you. And this piece I'm now in the process of converting to run on the Oculus Rift, so it will be available to be shown both as the immersive projection I've been doing for over 10 years, but also on a stereo headset. And I must say, the first time that these Volkspolizei popped up, I screamed. So yes, now I do believe there is a difference between 2D and stereo. The first piece that I did with this sort of stereo VR technology was as a tilt brush artist in residence, using their 3D brushes to create this very gestural, sort of calligraphic garden. And then these fuzzy cloud people, each of them staring at their smartphones. And it's also a 3D spatial sound installation where if you're just standing in the middle, you hear these murmurings. You need to go and sit down next to a figure, put your head in their head. And then you'll hear that some of them are murmuring sort of a mantra in a male voice. Those are from Trump. Other ones, mantra in a female voice. Those are from Hillary. And this evolved just out of my state of shock after the 2016 elections and trying to make some sense of it, although I don't think this piece makes much sense of it. So my art practice changed radically in October 2010. A friend of mine, Mark Swarek, dropped an email on me saying, hey, send me some 3D content. We're going to, I and Sander Wienhof and a bunch of friends are going to do a guerrilla intervention with geolocative augmented reality in MoMA. And I sent this art critic face matrix, a matrix of screaming faces that seem to deny their validity as art. And there was a nice little flash mob where Will Pappenheimer and other people in this audience might have also been, excuse me, press the wrong button. And surprisingly enough, MoMA found out day before and tweeted it, which of course was the best thing we could have asked for. So on the wave of that euphoria, then Mark and Sander and Will and I and a bunch of other people here formed the group Manifest.ar, and as Christiana mentioned, I said, well, you know, the only way we can top an intervention at MoMA is by doing it at the Venice Biennial. Who wants to come along? And the MoMA intervention and this intervention really helped cement our place in the art history. Christiana very kindly put this image of my Shades of Absence in her book Digital Art. It just shows artists whose works of public art were censored, so their erased silhouettes are standing in this pavilion, sort of trapped in this pavilion of terms of censorship. So that got us Manifest.ar a lot more commissions. For instance, from FACT Liverpool, Will and I did a piece called Biome Skelters, where we used a heart rate monitor, and Will got funding from Pace University to write this app where it monitors your heart rate level, and depending on whether you're an indiginator, defending the native biome, or an exoticator, advancing biome shifts by invading this biome, then as long as you keep your heart right in the right range, as you walk through the city of Liverpool, you would every 10 seconds plant copse of plants. And here you see how we sort of took over Liverpool with our plants. A very different piece, I Am Sound, is a generative sort of audio-visual portrait of each user. there's a small camera on the stand which takes an image of your face, projects it via projector on the telephone, like a xylophone, but made of panels of metal. And then my visual software scanned the image, took light and dark values from each panel, sent it to Christoph Reiser's generative music program, and he played that music, which was created out of your own face, on by vibrating those panels of the telephone. I've only shown this once. If I get to show it again, I want to change the code a little bit, so when you look away from the camera, everything will dissolve into cacophony. So not only will your face be generating the whole audiovisual experience, but it will also, however, trap you in its clutches, in its system. And you will be both seed and prisoner of the system. I got back to climate change themes in Gardens of the Anthropocene, commissioned from the Seattle Art Museum, where I looked at native plants that were predicted to be able to survive the climate change that would happen in Seattle. For instance, these very beautiful farewell to spring aptly named plants that I made much more sort of prickly succulents. And then if you look directly at one of the flowers, it enlarges and tries to engulf you, and you'll see that the stamens are actually an antenna, which is like sucking the electromagnetic radiation out of your smartphone. So I'm trying to like bring the technology into your experience and realize you are also part of the problem of generating the climate change. When Christiana asked me to do an AR piece for the 6th floor terrace with an algorithmic structure, together with my collaborator /P, we immediately thought of Lindenmeyer systems, which are growth rules for plants, but also corals. So we essentially put the 6th floor terrace underwater. Everything's kind of tropical blue. There's these bright, beautiful corals. But if you look a little bit closer, you'll see they're all out of plastic. Actually, over time, over the course of the day, and we like coffee cutting. The more people look at it, the more they bleach. And people look at it, will bleach to absolute white. So, before I start coughing, I'm going to end it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Just in time. So next up are Jonah Brooker-Cohen and Catherine Moriwaki. Jonah is an award-winning artist, researcher, and writer, and assistant professor of digital media and network culture in the Department of Journalism and Media